There's a moment most people never see. It doesn't happen when the empath is smiling. It doesn't happen when they're helping you. It happens quietly, internally, after the third, fourth, 10th time they've been hurt the same way. And by the time you notice it, it's already too late. Because when an empath is hurt repeatedly, something inside them doesn't just break, it rewires. At first, the empath responds the way their brain is designed to. Highly empathetic individuals show stronger activation in mirror neuron systems regions of the brain that simulate other people's emotions. This means they don't just understand your pain, they feel it. So when you hurt them, they don't immediately blame you. They analyze you. They excuse you. They absorb the emotional impact and try to fix it. But here's the problem. The human nervous system is not built for endless emotional injury without adaptation. Repeated emotional pain activates the brain's threat detection system, especially the amygdala. Over time, this creates a pattern. The empath starts associating people with danger. And this is where the shift begins. At first, they over-explain. Then they overgive. Then they overthink. But eventually, they go quiet, not because they're weak, because their brain is learning. This is called emotional conditioning, a process where repeated experiences reshape perception and behavior. The empath starts noticing patterns they ignored before, the tone in your voice, the inconsistency in your words, the way respect disappears when you think they won't leave, and something dangerous happens. The empathy doesn't disappear, but it becomes selective. Now here's what most people misunderstand. They think the empath is becoming cold. They're not. They're becoming accurate. The prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for decision-making, starts overriding emotional impulses. This creates a new internal rule. Feeling deeply is no longer enough. Evidence matters, and once that rule is installed, the empath becomes one of the hardest people in the world to manipulate. But the transformation doesn't stop there. Repeated emotional pain also triggers something called emotional fatigue. Studies show that constant emotional strain reduces the brain's ability to regulate stress hormones like cortisol. In simple terms, the empath gets tired of caring more than the other person. This is the exact moment they start pulling back, not dramatically, not loudly but strategically. They stop explaining. They stop chasing. They stop trying to be understood by people who benefit from misunderstanding them. And here's the part that shocks people. This is actually where the empath becomes the strongest. Because now, their empathy is no longer a weakness being exploited, it's a tool being controlled. They begin setting boundaries not out of anger, but out of clarity. They start observing instead of reacting. They stop giving unlimited access to people who provide limited respect. There's a quiet transformation that begins the moment an empath is hurt, and then hurt again, and then again. At first, nothing looks different on the outside. They still listen. They still care. They still try to understand you, even when you don't deserve to be understood. But inside their brain, something has already started changing. Because the human brain is not designed to experience repeated emotional pain without adapting to survive it. In the early stages, an empath's brain operates with heightened activity in regions linked to emotional resonance, what neuroscience connects to mirror neuron systems. This is why they don't just hear your pain. They internally simulate it. They feel it as if it's happening to them. But here's the part no one tells you. Every time that empathy is met with betrayal, dismissal, or emotional neglect, the brain logs it as a threat, not a mistake, a threat. And that activates one of the most powerful survival systems in the human body, the amygdala. The amygdala does not care about your intentions. It only tracks patterns. And when pain repeats, patterns become predictions. So now, the empath who once saw people as emotionally safe begins to experience a subtle shift. Their nervous system starts scanning, not for connection, but for danger. At first, it's almost invisible. A slight hesitation before opening up. A longer pause before trusting your words. A quiet internal question they never used to ask. Is this safe, or is this going to hurt again? This is how rewiring begins. Neuroscientists call this process neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to reorganize itself based on repeated experiences. And repeated emotional pain is one of the fastest ways to trigger it. Because from a biological standpoint, emotional pain activates the same neural pathways as physical pain. Let that sink in. To the brain, being repeatedly hurt emotionally is not metaphorically painful, it is neurologically real. Studies using brain imaging have shown that social rejection and emotional distress light up the same regions associated with physical injury. So when an empath is hurt again and again, their brain doesn't interpret it as just feelings. It treats it like ongoing damage, and the body responds accordingly. Stress hormones like cortisol begin to rise more frequently. The nervous system shifts into a semi-permanent state of alertness. This is why empaths who are repeatedly hurt often feel exhausted, even when they've done nothing physically demanding, because they are. Emotionally, neurologically, chemically, they are in a constant cycle of processing, anticipating, and protecting. And here's where it gets even more intense. With enough repetition, the brain stops waiting for the pain to happen. It starts predicting it before it arrives. This is called anticipatory stress, and it changes everything. Now, the empath isn't just reacting to reality, they are preparing for impact that hasn't even occurred yet. A delayed reply feels heavier. A change in tone feels suspicious. A small inconsistency feels like the beginning of another wound, not because they're overthinking, because their brain has been trained to connect these dots. What used to be openness becomes analysis. What used to be trust becomes pattern recognition. And slowly, without any announcement, the empath begins to evolve. But this evolution comes with a cost, because the same brain that once allowed them to connect deeply with others is now building protective barriers. Connections that once felt effortless now require evaluation. Vulnerability that once felt natural now feels risky. And the empath starts doing something they never had to do before. They start filtering. Who gets access? Who gets honesty? Who gets silence? And here's the most misunderstood part of all of this. This is not emotional damage. This is emotional adaptation. The brain is not breaking. It is recalibrating. It is learning that unlimited openness in a limited respect environment is dangerous. And it is correcting that imbalance. But the transformation doesn't stop at thoughts. It begins to affect behavior in ways that confuse the people around them. They speak less. They explain less. They tolerate less. Not because they've lost their ability to care, but because their brain has learned that caring without boundaries leads to pain, and the nervous system is designed to avoid repeated pain at all costs. So now, instead of leaning in, they lean back. Instead of giving more, they observe more. Instead of reacting emotionally, they process strategically. This is the moment the empath becomes unpredictable to those who once relied on their predictability. Because before, they were easy to read. They would forgive quickly. They would understand endlessly. They would stay even when staying cost them everything. But now, their brain has new data, and new data creates new behavior. And behavior is what people notice. Suddenly, the empath doesn't respond the same way. They don't chase clarity. They don't argue for connection. They don't beg to be understood, because their brain has already run the pattern. It already knows how the story ends. And this is where their internal power begins to rise. Not loudly, not aggressively, but with a quiet certainty that changes everything. Because once the brain has been rewired through repeated emotional pain, it becomes almost impossible to return to blind trust. The empath doesn't lose their depth. They lose their naivety. And that shift is permanent. Now they see what they once felt. They recognize what they once ignored. They understand what they once excused. And the most dangerous part? They no longer need closure, because their brain has already completed the pattern. And when an empath reaches that stage, you won't see a breakdown. You won't see a dramatic exit. You'll see something far more powerful. A calm, controlled, almost surgical withdrawal. Because internally, the rewiring is complete. The brain has learned the lesson. The nervous system has adapted. And the empath has changed in a way that cannot be undone. Not because they wanted to, but because their biology refused to let them stay the same. There comes a moment in an empath's life that looks like distance, but is actually precision. It doesn't happen overnight. It happens after patterns repeat so many times that the brain stops asking, "How do I fix this?" and starts asking, "Why am I still allowing this?" Because empathy, in its raw form, is unlimited. It gives without measuring. It understands without proof. It forgives before accountability even arrives. But the human brain is not designed to operate without limits forever. And when an empath is exposed to repeated emotional inconsistency, something begins to shift at the neurological level. At first, they still feel everything. That doesn't change. What changes is what they do with what they feel. Because every time empathy is given and not reciprocated, the brain registers an imbalance. And the brain hates imbalance. From a psychological standpoint, this creates what's known as cognitive dissonance state, where actions and outcomes don't align. I give honesty, but receive confusion. I show loyalty, but receive unpredictability. I offer care, but receive distance. This internal conflict forces the brain to resolve the tension, and it has only two options. Either keep believing in the same pattern or update the pattern entirely. This is where selective empathy is born, not as a defense mechanism of weakness, but as a correction mechanism of intelligence. Because the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for decision-making and behavioral control, starts stepping in. It begins overriding the emotional impulses that once operated freely. And suddenly, the empath who once reacted instantly pauses, not because they don't care, but because they're evaluating. This pause is everything, because in that space, something new happens. Observation replaces assumption. Data replaces hope. Patterns replace promises. And this is backed by behavioral science. The brain is constantly running predictive models based on past experiences. When those experiences become consistent, the brain stops treating them as exceptions and starts treating them as rules. So now, the empath doesn't need repeated explanations. They need consistent evidence. And when that evidence doesn't show up, something inside them quietly withdraws. Here's the part most people never notice. The empath is still feeling everything, but they are no longer reacting to everything. This is emotional regulation at its highest level, and it's not natural to them. It's learned through pain, because repeated emotional disappointment trains the brain to conserve energy. Caring deeply for the wrong people is not just emotionally draining, it is biologically expensive. Every emotional surge triggers chemical reactions: dopamine, oxytocin, cortisol. And when those cycles are constantly disrupted by inconsistency, the brain starts reducing investment to protect itself. This is why the empath becomes selective, not cold, not detached, selective. They begin choosing where their empathy goes the same way a strategist chooses where to place resources, because now they understand something they didn't before. Empathy without boundaries is self-destruction. And once that realization locks in, their behavior changes in ways that feel almost unrecognizable. They stop explaining their intentions to people who misinterpret them. They stop offering emotional access to people who misuse it. They stop trying to be understood by those who benefit from misunderstanding them. And this isn't emotional shutdown. It's emotional precision. Because selective empathy doesn't mean feeling less. It means directing feeling correctly. This is where the empath becomes dangerous to toxic dynamics, because they are no longer predictable. Before, you could rely on their patience. You could rely on their forgiveness. You could rely on their willingness to stay, even when staying made no sense. But now, there are conditions. Unspoken, but real. Consistency matters. Respect matters. Effort matters. And if those variables aren't present, the empath doesn't argue. They adjust. Quietly. Strategically. And here's the psychological shift that changes everything. They stop asking, how can I make this work? And start asking, does this deserve to work? That single question rewires the entire dynamic, because now empathy is no longer given freely. It is earned, not through words, but through patterns. And patterns don't lie. From a neuroscience perspective, this shift is tied to increased activity in areas responsible for risk assessment and impulse control. In simple terms, the empath is no longer operating purely from emotional instinct. They are integrating logic. And when emotion and logic align, decisions become final. That's why when a fully aware empath pulls back, it feels sudden to everyone else. But internally, it was gradual, calculated, tested over time. Every ignored boundary, every repeated behavior, every moment where effort wasn't matched. All of it was being recorded, not consciously at first, but neurologically, constantly, until one day, the threshold is crossed, and the empath system updates. No announcement, no warning, just a shift. Now they invest differently. They listen more than they speak. They watch more than they react. They give less, but what they give is intentional. And here's the part that confuses people the most. When an empath becomes selective, they actually become more powerful in relationships that are healthy, because their empathy is no longer diluted. It's focused, which means the right people experience a deeper, more genuine connection than ever before, while the wrong people experience distance they can't understand. And that contrast reveals everything, because selective empathy is not about rejection, it's about alignment. It's about recognizing that not everyone deserves the same version of you. And once an empath understands that there is no going back, they will still feel deeply, they will still care intensely, but they will no longer ignore reality to protect potential. They will no longer sacrifice themselves to maintain connection, and they will no longer confuse emotional intensity with emotional safety, because now their empathy has evolved from something that was once automatic into something that is now intentional. And that transformation doesn't just protect them, it elevates them. Because an empath who chooses where to feel controls everything that once controlled them. And once that control is established, their presence becomes rare, their energy becomes valuable, and their empathy becomes something not everyone gets to experience anymore. There's a moment that feels like rejection, but it isn't. It feels like punishment, but it's not. It feels like the empath is pulling away to make a point, but the truth is far more unsettling. They're not trying to hurt you. They've simply stopped participating in a pattern that was hurting them. Because when an empath withdraws, it doesn't come from anger. It comes from exhaustion that has crossed a neurological limit. At the beginning, they try everything. They communicate. They explain. They adjust themselves in ways most people would never even consider. And every time they do this, their brain releases chemicals tied to connection, dopamine for reward, oxytocin for bonding. But when those efforts are ignored, dismissed, or taken for granted, something critical happens. The expected reward doesn't arrive, and this creates what neuroscience calls a reward prediction error. In simple terms, the brain expected connection, but received disappointment. Once or twice, the brain tolerates it. But repeated enough times, it starts updating the equation. Effort does not equal reward here, and once that equation changes, behavior follows. Because the brain is wired for efficiency. It will not continue investing energy into something that consistently produces loss. This is where withdrawal begins. Not as a decision made in one dramatic moment, but as a gradual reduction of investment. They respond a little slower. They share a little less. They stop initiating conversations that once felt natural, not to manipulate, not to test you, but because their brain is quietly cutting off a losing strategy. And here's the part that most people completely misread. They think the empath is playing games, but what's actually happening is far more biological than emotional. The empath is removing reinforcement. In behavioral psychology, reinforcement is what keeps a behavior alive. Attention, validation, emotional reactions. These are all forms of reinforcement. If someone behaves poorly but still receives attention, connection, or emotional energy, their behavior continues. Not because they're evil, but because it works. And for a long time, the empath unknowingly provides that reinforcement. They forgive quickly. They stay available. They keep showing up, even when the behavior doesn't deserve it. But once the empath withdraws, that reinforcement disappears. And when reinforcement disappears, behavior becomes unstable. It either escalates or collapses. This is why when an empath pulls back, the other person often reacts intensely. Suddenly, there's confusion, frustration, even anger, because the system that was once predictable is no longer feeding the same response. And the brain doesn't like losing a reward it became used to. This triggers what's known as extinction behavior. When a previously rewarded behavior stops being rewarded, the brain temporarily increases the behavior in an attempt to regain the reward. That's why you might see sudden effort, unexpected messages, emotional reactions that were never there before. But here's the critical part. The empath is no longer responding the same way, because their brain has already completed the learning process. It has already recognized the pattern. And once recognition turns into certainty, the emotional attachment begins to dissolve, not instantly, but irreversibly. This is what makes their withdrawal feel so final, because it's not based on a temporary feeling. It's based on accumulated evidence. And evidence doesn't argue, it concludes. Now let's talk about the internal shift that happens at this stage. The empath stops seeking closure. This alone changes everything. Because closure psychologically is the brain's attempt to resolve uncertainty. But when patterns become clear enough, uncertainty disappears. There's nothing left to solve, nothing left to decode. The brain has already answered the question. And once that happens, the need to chase explanations vanishes. This is why the empath becomes quiet. Not because they don't have anything to say, but because they no longer need to say it. And silence in this context is not weakness, it's resolution. It's the brain signaling, we're done investing here. And here's where the real power begins. Because when emotional energy is withdrawn from one place, it becomes available somewhere else. The empath starts redirecting it. into themselves, into their peace, into relationships that don't require constant repair. And this is not just emotional, it's physiological. Chronic emotional stress has been shown to elevate cortisol levels, disrupt sleep patterns, weaken immune function, and even impact heart health. So when the empath withdraws from a toxic dynamic, they are not just protecting their feelings. They are protecting their body. Their nervous system begins to stabilize. Their mental clarity improves. Their energy returns. And for the first time in a long time, they feel safe. Not because the world changed, but because they changed their exposure to it. And this is why their withdrawal is not a loss. It's a correction, a realignment with what the brain and body were asking for all along. But here's the part that hits the hardest. Once an empath reaches this stage, they rarely go back, because the brain does not unlearn what it has fully understood. It doesn't forget the pattern. It doesn't ignore the data. It moves forward with it. And that makes their absence feel permanent, not dramatic, not explosive, just complete, because they didn't leave impulsively. They left after staying longer than they should have, after trying more than they needed to, after giving more than was ever returned. So when they finally withdraw, it's not an emotional reaction. It's a final decision backed by biology, psychology, and experience. And that's why it feels so different. There are no mixed signals, no half-presence, no lingering attempts to fix what has already been understood. Just distance, clear, intentional, unapologetic, and the most powerful part, they don't need you to understand it, because for the first time, they understand it themselves. And that changes everything. Because an empath who no longer seeks